They called it her walking brush pile, and they set it to her face at the Cedar Fork feed store the morning she came in for a roll of net wire. The whole bench of men grinning while Vernon Kell asked, loud enough for the office, whether Wanetta Sable had finally decided to run all 132 of the stinking things through the sale ring and put the graze into steers like a person. With sense. The bench laughed. Nettie set her money on the counter and said she believed she would keep the goats a while longer, and she carried her wire out to the truck with her back straight and her ears burning, and behind her the laughter had that particular Ring Valley men keep for a widow who will not take good advice. She was 48 years old that fall, the fall of 1961, and she had been a widow for 5 of those years, and she farmed a hardscrabble quarter section up under Cutbank Ridge at the dry end of the Lost Draw country, where the brush crowded in thick along every draw and the tall grass cured off pale gold by August, and the good families down on the deep bottom grass had always privately agreed that a woman alone could not hold it. Del Sable had died in a rollover on the Ridge Road, a truck gone off the shoulder in a night rain, and after the funeral the valley had been kind to Nettie in the way people are kind about a place they are quietly certain will be for sale inside 2 years. They brought hot dishes. They mentioned gently that Vernon Kell was always looking to add grass, and that there was no shame in a fair price. Nettie thanked them for the food, and she did not sell, and within a year she had done the thing that turned the valley's pity into open ridicule. She had raised up, off a few cheap duds and a borrowed billy, a herd of 132 scrub-brush goats. The goats had a reputation, and the reputation was that they were foolishness on 4 legs. Everyone in the Lost Draw country knew what a goat was and what a goat was good for, which was to say almost nothing a cattleman respected. They were wiry, homely, dun-and-black animals with yellow devil eyes and hard little hooves, and a way of standing up on their hind legs to strip a hedge that looked like pure spite. And they ate. Lord, how they ate, but never the good grass a steer wanted. Always the brush and the briar and the bark and the weeds, and they fenced worse than they ate, going over and under and through net wire a cow would have respected. And they stank, the billies especially, and worst of all, past every other sin, they were never quiet. A herd of goats did not drift and graze the peaceable way a bunch of cattle did. It clattered, a loose, endless racket of bells and bawling, and the dry, tearing crunch of browse, 132 mouths working at every green and woody thing that a sensible person left standing all day, up and down the draws. The men at the feed store agreed that if a person had set out on purpose to design the single most worthless creature a dry country outfit could keep, they could not have improved on a scrub goat, and that only a woman gone soft with grief would feel a whole quarter section with the stinking things. Wanetta Sable was not, by the reckoning of the men on the feed store bench, the sort of person anyone expected to know better. She was a spare, weathered woman with sunlines at her eyes and graying dark hair she kept tucked up under a faded straw sun hat, quiet by nature and quieter since Del died. And she had never in her life been one to argue a point in front of an office full of men. She kept to her place. She did her own fencing and her own doctoring and put up her own hay and kept a garden that fed her through the winter, and she read the almanac, the extension bulletins, the old range notes Del's people had kept in a cracker tin on the porch, and she trusted to things she had watched with her own eyes over a thing a bench full of men agreed was true. That habit was about to make her the most laughed-at woman in the valley, and then Though not one of the men grinning at the feed store that morning would have believed it, the one they all came to. What none of them troubled to ask was why. Not one man on that bench, in all the weeks of easy laughter, ever thought to ask Wanetta Sable why a careful woman who counted every bale and would not waste a strand of wire would go out of her way to raise up 132 animals that everyone knew ate poor and fenced worse and brought nothing at the sale ring. They did not ask because they were certain they already knew the answer, and the answer was that grief had made her foolish. But Nettie had a reason, and the reason was a thing she had watched happen years before, on this very ground with her own 2 eyes. It had been Dell who first brought the notion home, back before he died. Off an old Basque herder named Acre who had run sheep and goats through the dry ranges out west and stopped a season to help them clear brush and put up a corral. Acre had grown up herding in the chaparral country down toward the California line, where the brush stood head high and cured off like tinder, and the fires came every dry fall as sure as the wind. And he had told Dell, in the flat certain way of a man passing on something his own people had learned the hard way, that where he came from a man did not fight the fire when it came, he starved it before it came, and the way he starved it was goats. A goat, Acre said, would clean a draw and a fence line and a slope right down to bare-browsed ground where a cow would stand and starve. And fire could not run across ground that had already been eaten, that a hard-worked herd, moved right, would cut a man a fire-break wider and cheaper than any he could plow. Dale had half laughed at first, the way a cattleman laughs at a sheep-herder's notions. But Acre had not been spinning a yarn. That fall, Dell kept back a dozen does out of curiosity, and the next dry year. When a grass fire got loose down the section road and ran a mile of ditch bank, it came up against a strip along their draw where the small herd had browsed the brush to nothing. And Nettie saw with her own eyes the thing no bulletin had ever quite made her believe. Where the goats had eaten, the fire lay down and died, and the grass beyond it stood green. She remembered the way Acre had said it, because he had not said it the way a man sells you a thing. He had said it the way a man tells you the plain shape of the world and does not much care whether you believe him. They had been eating their noon dinner in the shade of the half-built corral, and Dell had asked, half joking, whether he meant to say a bunch of stinking goats could do what a fire crew and a plowed guard could not, and Acre had said he did not mean to say it. He meant it was so, and that Dell could believe it or watch his place go the next bad fall. It was all one to him. There had been no heat in it. It was the certainty of a man who has watched a thing be true so long that other men's doubt has stopped being interesting. And when Acre rolled his bed and moved on at the end of the season, the notion he had planted stayed, and the dozen Dell kept back proved him right, and Nettie never forgot the flat, sure sound of a man passing on a thing worth more than he was ever paid for. So it was not, whatever the valley believed, a thing Nettie had dreamed up out of grief. It was a thing she had inherited twice over, once from an old herder's people by way of a noon dinner in the shade, and once from watching a dozen goats turn a grass fire off her husband's draw before ever the valley thought to laugh. She had tested it the way she tested everything, not by arguing it, but by watching it, year on year, until the watching left no room for doubt. On her own brushy ground, the ground the valley pitied, a fire could come and lie down at her line while it ran clean over theirs. A dozen goats had done that on the Sable place. She had 132 now, raised up on purpose over 4 patient years off cheap does and kept kids and a borrowed billy. She did not need a bulletin or a county man or a single word of anyone's blessing to know what 132 would do, and she did not much care that the valley thought her a fool for knowing it, because she had learned long since that being thought a fool by people who have not watched what you have watched is a cheap enough price for being right. The valley found out, because valleys always find out, and the valley laughed. Word went round the feed store and the church steps and the sale barn within a season that the Sable widow had gone and raised up better than 100 of the stinking things, a whole quarter section of them now, and the country settled in to enjoy it. They could hear the herd from the section road, they said, that clattering racket of bells and bawling carrying on a still morning. And they pitied her nearest neighbors, and they marveled that a grown woman would do such a thing on purpose. Vernon Kell, who ran the best grass in the valley on the deep bottom ground and ran the country's opinions besides, allowed to the whole feed store that he'd offered the widow a fair price for that ground twice over and been turned down flat, and that now she'd filled it with brush-eating stock that fouled the draws and brought nothing at the ring, and that he supposed a person got the outfit they deserved. The men laughed. Not one of them asked the only question that mattered, which was what a woman who had watched a herd of goats turn a fire off her ground might know that a bench full of men who had never watched anything of the kind did not. The mockery had a face, and the face was the feed store, and Nettie met it the only way she knew, which was to go in for what she needed and come out again without giving them the satisfaction of an argument. She heard it stop when the door swung and start again lower, the way talk does when its subject walks in. One of the older men turned on the bench that first season and asked her, for the pleasure of the room, whether she was raising them goats for the milk or the smell, because he couldn't rightly tell which they were worse at. The room laughed. Nettie said she was raising them for neither, and left it there and paid for her wire and went out, and behind her the laughter had a slightly puzzled edge under it that it had not had going in, because a person who will not defend a foolish thing is harder to laugh at than a person who will. She had learned in 5 years of being a widow the valley expected to fail, that there is a particular loneliness in being the only one on a place who knows what the place needs. She did not enjoy it. She had simply stopped expecting company in it. So when the Basque sheepman up in the high range finally sold out for good and moved his people to town, and had a borrowed billy and a string of scrub as he could not carry to a rented lot, Wanetta Sable did the thing that first set the valley to laughing. She took the goats for almost nothing, a few dollars in a sack of her seed potatoes, and she trailed them home down the ridge road in a rattling stock rack, and she set herself to raising up the biggest goat herd the Lost Draw country had ever seen, not for the milk, not for the sale ring, but to eat her fire lines clean the way a dozen had once eaten the draw that turned the grass fire off. Dell's place. She was not keeping a milk herd. She was not soft with grief. She was, quietly and on purpose, raising a fire break on the hoof against a fire she knew came around as sure as the dry years did, and she was raising it out of animals the rest of the valley would have run through the ring without a second thought. The 4 years of the raising stayed with her, in the plain way patient work stays with a person who has done a great deal of it alone. A scrub kid is a fragile, foolish thing its first weeks, prone to chill and to scours, and to getting itself hung in the brush and lost. And Nettie lost her share the first spring, and learned the way she learned everything, by doing it wrong once and not twice. She kidded the does out on clean ground and doctored what she could and stood over the weak ones, and she culled hard for the weary, rustling kind that would work the brush and left off the soft ones that only wanted the good grass. And every year the herd that spread out along her draws was bigger and harder working than the year before. By the fall of 1961, it stood at 132 head, wiry dun and black goats that knew her voice and her feed bucket and knew the boundaries of her ground the way a good dog knows a yard, and spent the long days of that dry summer strung out along her draws and fence lines in a loose working front, heads up in the brush, doing the one thing on earth a goat does better than any creature living. There was a craft to holding a herd that big to the line she wanted eaten, and Nettie had it now, 4 years deep. A goat will range wide and will drift if a body lets it, up the draw and over the ridge and into the neighbor's brush and gone, so through the working months she penned them close on the ground she wanted browsed, and moved the pen along the fire lines a little each week, the same call every evening, teaching 132 goats that home was the place the bucket was and the shed lot was the place to settle when the light went, so that they cleaned each strip of brush right down to the dirt before she moved them on and came drifting back at dark of their own accord, bells clanking, to be shut in against the coyotes and the cats. She counted them every night. It became a thing she did the way another woman might say her prayers. Standing at the shed lot in the last of the light while the herd came filing in off the darkening draws, counting the dun and black shapes through the gate, a habit that would matter more than she knew before the fall was out, because a woman who counts her herd every night is a woman who knows to the head that her lines are being eaten clean. She watched them work, too, in the evenings, the way some people watch weather. She would stand at the draw edge with the day's heat going out of the ground and follow the working front of them along the brush, and she could see, if you knew to look, the pattern of it, how they favored exactly the fuel that carried a fire. The cured tall grass and the oily brush and the dry briar in the draw bottoms and along the fence rows where a fire would run hottest, and left behind a wide belt of bare browsed ground that no flame on earth could cross. And she knew a thing the plow a guardman did not, that a goat does not merely nibble the edge of the brush, it eats the fire's road out from under the whole country, all summer, for its own greedy belly's sake, and never sends a bill. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell who would have heard it. But she saw it, and she filed it away with 4 years of the same, and she went on holding her clattering herd to the lines while the valley laughed and let the brush crowd its barns and waited, though none of them knew they were waiting, for the dry wind that was already building up over the ridge. There was a neighbor's brushy slope she watched that summer without meaning to, a lease piece of the Ferris place that lay just across the line fence from her own, and it taught her more than any bulletin could have about the difference her goats made. The Ferris brush and her own draw stood on the same dry ground under the same hard sky, and there the sameness ended. Where her herd worked, the slope stood eaten to bare ground and gray stobs, a firebreak wide as a road across the fence. Where no goat had ever set a hoof, the brush stood thick and oily and head high, cured off like a stacked fire waiting on a match, hers eaten safe. Theirs standing ready to burn, and not a soul in the valley but her to read what the fence line was plainly saying. She thought once of walking over and telling them. She did not, because she knew how it would land. A widow with a yard full of goats come to lecture a man on his own brush, and she had long since made her peace with the plain hard fact that a thing seen is not a thing that can be given to a person who has decided not to look, for she had come, over the years, to hear the clatter differently than the rest of the valley did. To Vernon Kell and the men on the feed store bench, the goat racket was simply the worst thing about an already worthless animal, a foolish noise carried on the wind off a foolish woman's place. But Nettie had learned to read it. She knew that a steady clatter of bells and browsing along the draw meant the herd was working the worst of the fire ground. She knew that a sudden, hard swell of bawling meant a coyote was moving the fence line, or a cat was down off the ridge, or a stranger's truck had turned in off the road, and that her herd would give her that word a full minute before she'd have known any other way. The sound the whole valley mocked her for was, to her ear, at once a work song and a watch bell, the plain audible proof that 132 tireless mouths were out eating the fire's road off every line she owned. She had stopped hearing it as noise a long time ago. She heard it as safety and as a roof over her head come the dry wind. And by the end of that terrible fall, so would they. The land answered the way worked ground answers. Through the early fall of 1961, the Lost Draw country baked under a sky that gave nothing. Week on week of hard, dry heat, with the grass long cured and the brush gone to tinder, and the wind out of the west drying everything harder every afternoon, and up on Cutbank Ridge, in the head of every draw, the fuel stood ready. It stood everywhere that dry fall builds it up, in the fence rows and the ditch banks and the untended slopes, thick and cured and waiting, the way a fire year always begins as only a dry spell. The valley saw the brush and thought little of it. There was always brush in a dry fall. A man plowed a lazy guard around his buildings and cursed the wind and got on with his hauling. The way people do about a thing that has always been a nuisance and never yet been worse. That was the fall the valley learned different. On Wanetta Sable's quarter section, that same early fall, the brush had stood ready too, and had been eaten off before ever the wind came. Where 132 goats had worked the draws and the fence lines from first light to dark all summer. The fuel could not stand and could not carry. The oily brush was browsed to gray stobs, the tall grass eaten to the crown, the briar and the draw bottoms stripped to bare dirt, and Nettie's lines, alone in all that country, went into the dry wind with a firebreak eaten clean around every field and building she owned. She could walk her draws in the September heat and find nothing tall enough to carry a flame, could stand at her fence of an evening and hear the herd clattering contentedly along ground that would not burn, while every other man's brush stood cured and thick and ready, and she knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had watched it 4 years running, that her ground was starved of fire while the country around her had let the fuel build up unchecked, and the rest of the valley that same fall was doing the opposite. Up and down the deep bottom grass and along the section roads and through all the wide brushy range of the well-run places, the fuel built up out of the draws with nothing to hold it, no herd, no goat. Nothing but a lazy plowed guard a hard wind would throw sparks clean across. By late September, the brush stood head-high on every slope and cured off oily and gray, and men plowed their guards a little wider and watched the ridge of an evening and told each other it was a dry one and would want watching, and drove to the feed store and said as much and did not. Any of them. Keep a single goat against it. The brush was only brush. Everyone knew brush was a nuisance and nothing more. And then, in the first week of October, on a day the wind came up hard and hot out of the west, a fire got loose on Cutbank Ridge, and the valley learned what a wildfire is. It came the way these things come, without a bell, on a hot, dry afternoon when the wind had been building all day. A man on the bottom ground looked up from his loading to a sky gone brown and wrong over the ridge, and a smell under the heat like a burning field, and walked out to see the fuel up on Cutbank Ridge gone over all at once, a wall of smoke and running flame coming down off the ridge on the wind in a front that ate the light as it came. Where it hit, the brush went. Not scorched, gone, roaring up in a wall 2 and 3 times the height of a man, and throwing sparks a quarter-mile ahead into cured grass that caught and carried and threw sparks of its own, the front leaping every plowed guard and ditch and road like they were nothing at all. It went down the valley like a flood made of fire. The fairest slope went in minutes. The bottom pastures Vernon Kell was proudest of went in an hour. The tall grass carrying the flame right up to his very sheds. Ranch after ranch of the best brushy range in the country went black to the dirt. A haystack and a pole barn and a year's winter feed eaten off in a roar of wind and flame, while the men who owned them stood in their yards with their hats in their hands and nothing on God's earth to do about it. The fear changed the way the valley moved. Men who had plowed a lazy guard were out in the smoke now, dragging fresh furrows they hoped the fire would not jump, and wetting down their roofs and beating at the edges of the running grass with wet sacks like men who had already lost, and it did no good, because you cannot beat back a wildfire on a hard wind with a wet sack any more than you can plow away the wind itself. They watched their hay go and did the sums no rancher wants to do, of a herd to feed and a burned range and a winter coming with nothing in the stack, and the talk at the feed store that had been so easy all summer went out of the men entirely. Because there is no laughing left in a country where the grass is running with fire and the ridge is still throwing sparks. The valley had spent a laughing summer, certain it knew what was worth keeping and what was worthless. It was learning, in the worst way there is, that it had had the whole thing backward. The county sent out a man from the fire office, and the fireman stood in the black smoking yard of a burned-out place and told a knot of ruined ranchers what by then they had already begun, with a dawning horror to understand that the fuel had built up too heavy in the draws through the dry years, and that once a fire was up and running on a wind like that one there was no guard and no crew and no machine that would turn it. A man in the crowd asked him, in the flat, hopeless voice of a man who already knows the answer, whether there was anything on earth that would actually stop a fire dead in a year like this one, and the fireman spread his hands and said that short of a wide belt of bare ground eaten or plowed down to the dirt, he knew of nothing that would turn a front that size. There was no place in that valley, he said, a man could have counted on. No place, that is, but one, though the fireman did not know it, and it would fall to an old hired hand standing in the black to say so. It was Vernon Kell's own old cowhand, a leathery man named Alton Reese, who had ridden the country 40 years and forgotten more about dry range than most men learn, who said it first. And he said it standing in the black burned yard with the toe of his boot in the ash and his hat pushed back. He said he'd rode the fire line that morning to look for stock, and that the whole valley was burned to the dirt as far as a man could see, every draw and every slope and every haystack gone, every one, he said, but the widow Sable's. He'd come up on her line, he said, and it was like riding up on a green island in a black sea. The fire had run straight down onto her ground on the same wind that took everybody else, and it had come up against that wide-eaten belt where the goats had browsed the brush to the dirt, and it had lain down and died right there at her fence. And beyond it her grass stood green, and her hay stood stacked, and her buildings stood whole. The men around him went quiet, and Alton Reese, who was too old and too tired to care much for feed-store laughter, said the thing none of the rest of them had let themselves think yet. He said, "It's them goats. It's them stinking brush goats of hers. They've been eating the fire's road off that ground all summer while we plowed our little guards and cursed the wind, and hers is the only place left standing in this whole valley, and every one of us laughed at her for it." No one laughed then. There is a particular silence that falls on a crowd of proud men when they understand all at once that the person they have been mocking was right, and it fell on that black burned yard, and it did not lift. They stood there in the ash with their burned range and their empty haystacks and their herds to feed, and they understood that the widow Sable, whom they had counted a fool, had spent the whole laughing summer doing the one thing that would have carried them all through, and that not a man among them had troubled once to ask her why. Some of them, standing there, would have been remembering their own words, the sail ring come fall, the walking brush pile, the steers a person of sense would keep instead, and finding those words gone suddenly bitter in the mouth. It is one thing to be wrong. It is another to have laughed at the one who was right while your own hay went up in the field. And there is no man harder on a proud man in that moment than himself. They stood in the long silence, and they did the sum of it, every one of them, and not a word was said that a person would want to remember. Vernon Kell said nothing at all. He stood a while at the edge of the black yard with his jaw working, a big proud man who had run the valley's opinions for 30 years and had just heard his own hand name him in front of everyone the loudest of the fools. Then he got in his truck and he drove. And where he drove, though it cost him more than he could have said to do it, was up off his burned bottom ground to the dry end of the valley, to the thin brushy quarter section under the ridge where the goat bells clattered on the wind, to the fence of the woman he had offered to buy out twice and mocked a dozen times, to ask her, hat in his hands, for help. Nettie was at the shed lot when his truck turned in, and she heard the goats tell her he was coming before she saw the dust. The hard, sudden swell of them bawling along the road, as they always did for a stranger's truck, and she stood and waited by the fence with the feed bucket still in her hand. Vernon Kell got out slow. He was a big man and a proud one, and he did not have the first idea how to do what he had come to do, and he stood at her fence a long moment looking out over her grain-standing grass and her whole buildings and her stacked hay, at a thing no other man in the valley had to look at any more, and at last he took off his hat, which the valley had never once seen Vernon Kell do at a fence. And he said he reckoned she'd seen what the fire had done. Nettie said she had. He said Alton allowed her place was the only one left standing. She said it was. Her lines had been eaten clean all summer. And Vernon Kell looked at his hat in his hands, and he said, in a voice gone low and rough, that he'd been wrong about her goats, and that he was sorry for the way he'd talked, and that he was burned out for the year with a herd to feed and no hay and a note at the bank, and could she, tell him how a man went about getting a bunch of his own onto his ground before another dry fall took him under. She did not gloat. That was the thing the valley would remember about Wanetta Sable long after the firefall had passed into an old story told at the feed store. That when the turning came, and it came all the way, she took not 1 ounce of pleasure in it. She had every right in the world to stand at that fence and let Vernon Kell feel the full weight of every word he had ever said on that bench, and she did not. She looked at the big proud man, turning his hat in his hands, and she thought, if she thought anything, of empty haystacks and a hard winter. And she said only that kids took patience and the better part of a year to raise up to any use, but that she had a pair of does or two she could spare and a young Billy she could loan, and that she'd help him get a bunch going and show him how to hold it to his fire lines, and that he'd want to run them along the draws and the barn lots first thing come spring, before the brush ever cured off. She named him a fair price for the does, the same she'd have named anyone, and not a dollar of grudge in it. And Vernon Kell, who had told the whole feed store to run her herd through the ring, stood at the widow's fence and thanked her, and meant it, and drove home with a pair of scrub does bawling in the stock rack behind him. He was the first, and then they came. The Ferris family came, burned out to the fence line, and Nettie gave them a start of kids and would not take a dollar for it, not from a family with a black range and a winter coming. The families off the section road came. The old hand Alton Reese came on his own account, embarrassed and grinning, and said he'd wanted a goat bunch for 30 years and been too proud to keep one. And Nettie gave him a pair of does and told him he was a fool for waiting, and it was the closest thing to a joke the valley ever heard her make. Through the rest of that terrible fall and into the winter, the trucks came up the ridge road to the dry end of the valley one after another, to the fence of the woman they had laughed at, to buy her kids and beg her does and take her hard-won advice, and to look, most of them, at the one green place left in the country and understand at last what they had been laughing at. She sold what she could sell and gave away what needed giving, and she showed every one of them, patient and plain, how to hold a herd to the lines a body wanted eaten and have the goats on the brush in the spring before ever it cured off. She had been the most laughed-at woman in the valley in September. By the first snow, she was the reason half of them believed they'd have a place left to burn down the next dry fall at all. The danger passed, the way these things pass, when the fall rains finally came in cold and gray off the ridge and soaked the black ground and laid the fire season down for another year. The valley counted its losses and found them heavy. A year's hay gone off most of the good places, ranges burned to the dirt into a lean winter, more than one family carried only by the bank's patience and a neighbor's start of stock. It could have finished some of them, and everyone knew, without much wanting to say it, the one place the fire had not touched at all, and why. And in the years that followed, a strange and quiet thing settled over the lost draw country. It became, of all the unlikely things, goat country. The clatter that had once carried on the wind as a foolish woman's folly now rolled up from a dozen places at once, from the bottom ground and the section road and Vernon Kell's own home lots. The loose racket of bells and browsing rising off bunch after bunch every dry summer when the goats went out on the draws, and no one laughed at it any more. They had learned the hard way to hear it the way Nettie had always heard it, not as 100 worthless mouths, but as work being done, and as a roof kept over their heads, and as a fire break standing between a place and the thing on the ridge that could eat a year in an afternoon. Wanetta Sable never once threw it back at him, and that, in the end, was what made the valley take her in the way it had never taken a widow alone before. She could have. She had stood on that bench and taken their laughter for 5 long years. And when the turning came, she could have collected on every word of it, and she never did. She sold Vernon Kell his does fair, and gave the burned-out families their kids for nothing, and taught anyone who asked, and she never said, not once, that she had told them so, because she had not told them so. She had simply known and worked, and let the fire and the goats and the terrible fall say it for her. When a young couple new to the country asked her, a year on, why she'd kept those goats when the whole valley laughed, she only said that she'd watched a bunch of them turn a grass fire off her husband's draw years before ever the big fire came, and that a thing you have seen with your own eyes is worth more than a bench full of men who are sure. And then she went back to her fencing, because the rains had killed the fire season, but the dry draws would cure off again next fall, and the herd still had to be raised and held and counted in every night. And a woman who has been proven right does not get to skip the evening's work any more than a woman who has been laughed at does. They had said her goats were worthless in the dry fall of 1961, and in a way they were right. Worthless at the ring, worthless in the milk pail, worthless for anything a cattleman wrote in his book. What Wanetta Sable had understood, that none of them had troubled to ask, was that the worth of a brush goat was never in the sale ring at all. It was in the work, and the watch, and the endless hungry browsing of 132 tireless mouths, eating a danger off the ground before it could ever rise up on a hard wind and take a valley's winter feed, a worth that did not show at the sale barn and could not be laughed at once you had seen what its absence cost. The hungriest, homeliest, most worthless-seeming thing on her whole place had turned out to be the thing that saved the roof over her head, and she had known it all along, and she had never needed them to know it, only to be safe. As the old herder Acre had told her husband years before, in the shade of a half-built corral, the hungriest mouth on the place is not always the wasteful one. Sometimes it is the only thing standing between you and the day the fire comes down off the ridge. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that what they have isn't worth keeping. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, ask yourself this: how many of the loud, hungry, inconvenient things we're all so quick to be rid of are the very things quietly keeping us safe?